People will think, oh, yeah, I like this person, but it's just because they feel familiar. If I don't heal my childhood with a narcissistic or emotionally immature, emotionally unavailable parent, I will continue to date those people. It was all physiological. It was all below the radar of their conscious awareness. So we think we're going into adulthood and making these conscious choices about our partners, but actually,
Amazing.
And shocking and interesting to me is just that how much it affects people's health. And we think people walking around, oh, that's just, heart disease. Like, yeah, just change your diet. Yes, change your diet. And
Yeah. Welcome to the next episode of the podcast Perspective of the Mind. My name is Jenna, and every episode I bring to your attention people that may help you to live your best lives, trusting that you have the intelligence to apply your intuition, wisdom, and critical thinking to everything that you're hearing here. Maybe life is too busy with you right now, but I'm fully convinced that especially this episode deserves your attention. My special guest today is Jenna, who is a somatic therapist and helps people to get freedom from trauma and stress. We all need that, don't we? Enjoy listening to the great mind of Jenna.
Everything provided on this podcast is solely for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. The information provided shall not be considered diagnostic, treatment of mental health conditions, therapy, or anything similar, and under any circumstances shall not replace medical or mental health treatment. The opinions of the host or guests are solely the views of the individuals and can be changed at any time.
Hello, Jenna.
hello.
I really appreciate and love your work. And I'm so grateful and happy that I have the chance today to introduce you and your work to my audience. So you're
Yeah.
so very welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before I record an episode, I usually set up my intentions towards that episode.
Great.
And the intention for today's episode is to be helpful and practical, very practical to people. And I'm sharing that with you just because I hope you join me in that intention.
Perfect. Yes.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
So, Jenna, your work is deeply rooted in helping people, right, to find freedom from trauma and stress.
Yes.
And we all, that's my personal opinion, we all have been to some sort of trauma during
Yeah.
our lives, right?
Yes.
Yes, for some with bigger intensity than for the others, but we all have experienced some trauma in our lives, unfortunately. That's somehow related
Yes.
to being a human, maybe.
Yes. Being human's hard.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And so I think this episode is going to be very helpful to people. And as I'm aware that maybe not all of the people that are watching us right now are in the psychological area as you and me, we are, I would like to start with the question, what does it mean trauma and what does it mean traumatic experience?
So trauma, we've cast a wider net in terms of what the definition of trauma is because we understand more of the way that stress, unresolved stress or toxic stress affects the body. It's not just, oh, I went to war or I got in a car accident or I was, these what we used to call big T traumas or shock trauma. It's not just that anymore. What we understand about trauma now is that trauma lives in the body and not in the story. And that comes, from Peter Levine. I want to credit Dr. Peter Levine, who's one of my teachers and mentors and the founder of Somatic Experiencing, around this idea, which is that, again, that the trauma lives in the body and the nervous system and not in the story. And so if we're going to define and understand trauma from that lens, trauma then becomes or is, and it's actually more influenced the opposite direction, which is we know that trauma affects the body and the nervous system much in a much deeper way than we ever thought. And so any stressor that overrides the nervous system's ability to cope, we would consider trauma. And so something can be traumatic, but doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is going to develop trauma symptoms. So we can go through stressors and trauma and not necessarily always develop symptoms. And we see this in wild animals. Wild animals go through traumatic and stressful experiences all the time. They're being hunted, they're hunted. I mean, it's very cutthroat out there for them, for wild animals. And we don't see them, however, because they don't have these big neocortices in their brains that are overriding their nervous systems all the time. They shake the trauma off and they go about their day. They don't walk around with trauma symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
So the ways in which human beings develop trauma symptoms is because those natural defensive responses in the body, like fight, flight, and freeze, get stuck. It's like a skipping record. Or if you ever have kayaked or stood by a river and watched leaves get stuck in an eddy on the side of the river. That's like what trauma does. It's sort of in the way that traumatic memory gets laid down is such that the traumatic memory doesn't get updated. So it's like we're all walking around with not updated software on our phones. And we all know what that's like. If you haven't updated the software on your phone, like you're gonna be, apps aren't gonna work, things are gonna glitch. It's like all these pieces start to go wrong. And so it's actually, healthy memory is just memory that's been updated. It's just current. It doesn't necessarily have to be accurate. Memory is actually highly inaccurate, typically. But that's not actually the point. We don't really care. It doesn't really matter what the cognitive or explicit memory is of what I remember as a story. It's more about what is the implicit memory that the body is holding. Implicit memory is like riding a bike. As soon as I get back on a bike, I remember how to ride a bike if I know how to ride a bike. And that's really where trauma is living and being stored, is in the body and the nervous system. And so the definition of trauma is anything that overrides our ability to release that and cope with that.
Mm-hmm. And I guess my abilities are different than your abilities. Then something can be traumatic for me and not for you.
That's right. Absolutely. Because you could have different developmental trauma experiences. And based on your upbringing versus my upbringing, we know that the quality of your attachment relationships in childhood are going to directly impact your ability to cope with stress and trauma as an adult. So folks that come in with more secure attachment, with less, they felt cared for and loved by someone, they're going to show more resilience in general, as an adult. Yeah.
And if we are going now to just to imagine that trauma, where is it situated in our body? Is it in our body? Is there a shape? Like, is it like a negative energy? What is that exactly?
Yes. Oh, I love this question. Okay, so we like to say the issues are in the tissues. So people can experience stress and trauma at every layer of tissue. So and in terms of, I'm trained in advanced touch skills for trauma therapists, which is its own kind of specific somatic part of somatic work, which is to support the release of trauma through touch. That actually is can be a really effective modality, especially for folks with developmental trauma. But the way that it kind of lives in the body is through cycles of settling and activation. So every single day, we go through cycles of cycles of settling and activation. So I get activated about something. I might go into some kind of sympathetic gas pedal energy in the body, maybe fight flight energy, or I just have a little more cortisol running through my body, and I had some coffee and I'm working today, like, well, I'm awake, I'm alive, I'm going. And then something happens. And then, and then maybe I have a break and I eat lunch, and now I'm settling, and I'm having like some parasympathetic brake pedal come online. So the body is like, oh, now I feel better, and I'm getting my blood sugar stabilizing after my coffee. Maybe I didn't have breakfast, and then I come out of lunch and I go back into a period of work, and I've got a little more cortisol, and it could just be not even stress. It could just be, oh, I'm awake and alive today. I'm excited to talk to you. Like, there's aliveness here in our conversation, for instance. So it can be like in the body in these cycles. And it's just a matter of the trauma comes when, or trauma symptoms come about when those cycles are too much for the person's resilience. So I like to say everybody's got their own like bowling alley, and everybody's bowling alley is a different width. So if I've got a lot of trauma, my width, my bowling alley is going to be really narrow. And so every time I bowl, my ball is going into the gutter, you know? And so there's this kind of versus someone with a little more resilience, they're like, they could not be a great bowler and still sort of make it, you know? Versus like the poor person who's like, oh my God, like I have to like,
Yeah.
you know, they're so narrow. They're so like, it's got it like I used to be the person who had to do an hour of yoga and an hour of meditation every single day to like be okay. Like that's not actually resilience. And so the trauma lives in the body in the sense of how resilient am I to those cycles of settling and activation? And can I come out of them successfully? Can I track myself? Can I notice the sensation and how that shows up in my body moment by moment? Which is called interoception. The tracking of sensation is actually a really important somatic practice. So it's difficult to answer your question in the sense of what it looks like, but from a physiological standpoint, we know that these cycles of settling and activation, depending on someone's ability to tolerate that and resolve those, is really going to show up in their body. So it could look like all sorts of things in the body, whether it's tightness in the diaphragm, the breath is really short and shallow all the time. They've got chronic pain, or they're like, oh, you know, people always are like, I hear this all the time of like, oh, my back always hurts. It's no big deal. People are constantly overriding these little aches and pains that are actually stuck stressors in the body. Like we know the physical therapy research is showing the majority of back pain issues is coming from unresolved trauma and emotional issues. And people are doing all these physical interventions like surgery and meds and cortisone shots and all these things when it's not the problem. It's not a physical structural problem, but it's in the tissues. The stress is living in the tissues. And so that's kind of a good example of, you know, folks are like, oh, you know, my foot's I'm always, you know, wiggling my foot around. It's like, yeah, that's a stuck flight response. So it's living in the body through these communications in the body. And, you know, practitioner needs to be trained to track that in someone's body, not just override that through, which is what a lot of traditional trauma treatment does, just overrides and desensitizes.
So we can just recap that trauma looks like different for different people, right? And that's the work of a therapist, basically, to track where exactly practice.
It's a somatic therapist. Yes, a somatic experiencing. Yeah, somatic experiencing therapist. I want to be specific. Yeah.
And Jenna, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, the last thing I was going to say about that is, yes, it looks different for everybody, but a nervous system's a nervous system's a nervous system.
Yeah.
So we're going to see a lot of patterns, you know, like I'm good at like noticing like, oh, I've seen this before. It's showing up in this person's body, but I know what this looks like. Here's the, you know, the presentation. I can tell they're holding this, this, and this, and they had a car accident, it came at them this way. And, you know, so I can see people's bodies and track what's kind of happened to them and make a really solid, educated guess based on what I'm seeing, but also what I notice in my own body and what's happening in the resonance between us.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Jenna, what are the main sources of our trauma? Like it's such a big question, right?
Yeah.
If you can just throw it out some of the sources, for example, that comes to your mind.
Yeah. So I would categorize them as there's a broad spectrum of things. And if you look there, I have an article, I write a Substack article every week. And I wrote an article called, it was a few months ago. It was called What They Don't Tell You About Mental Health Disorders. And it was essentially the way in which adverse childhood experiences affect us in adulthood and then show up as mental health, quote unquote, disorders. And so the reason I bring that in is because if you look up what the adverse childhood experiences are, things like physical neglect, emotional neglect and abuse, of course, you know, sexual abuse, having domestic violence in the home. There's some pretty clear patterns. So it's physical, witnessing violence, witnessing emotional abuse. The parental unit has distress in it. Moms having stress when the child's in utero. We know that absolutely babies take in fetal stress, prenatal stress. So I categorize trauma into kind of two categories: shock or big T trauma, what we used to think of as trauma, war, car accidents, things like that. And then there's also little T traumas. It could be a minor fall, a minor fender bender, emotional abuse and neglect, dating a narcissist, um, um, having an emotionally immature, emotionally unavailable, narcissistic parent. So these are kind of these subtler traumas that sort of build up over time and have the exact same effect as a big T trauma. The physiology is not different, really. There's like, in terms of like people want to say, oh, there's only big T trauma and little T trauma is not real, or that's just you're just being too sensitive. It's actually not true. They're very much showing up in similar ways. And actually, there's research that's coming out that's showing that little T trauma can actually be a lot more harmful and damaging over the long run than big T traumas. Big T traumas are kind of, they're fairly easy, frankly, to work through in my experience. And that's much easier. Like a one big T trauma or a few big T traumas is much simpler in theory than working with someone's like chronic attachment trauma.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of things that can show up. They'll show up in people's bodies and yeah. So
And how can those traumas influence our lives? And can you give us like specific examples so that
yeah,
we can
yes.
understand better?
Let me pull up that article actually when I could just kind of
Yeah.
re-reference it because then we'll know I'm not forgetting anything. Okay. So so if we go back to the adverse childhood experiences, the list of adverse childhood experiences is physical abuse from a parent, emotional abuse from a parent, sexual abuse from anyone, growing up with an alcoholic or drug abuser in the home, even mild like alcohol, weed. Okay. Weed is a dissociative. Cannabis is a dissociative. And so it'll kind of, even just babies being able to track the changes in the pupil of the parent is going to be, they'll experience that as potentially some form of neglect of the parent's not there. So even mild abuse of substances, a child's picking up on that, and that's going to affect them of like, is it safe in my home? Experiencing incarceration of a household member, of course, living with a family member experiencing any kind of mental illness, domestic violence in the home, the loss of a parent, emotional neglect, and physical neglect. So that's our main, and this comes out of research of at least 30,000 people in San Diego at Kaiser Medical Center. And they started studying this because people were dropping out of weight loss programs. And the folks that were dropping out had the highest rate of adverse childhood experiences. So to give you an example, the more adverse childhood ACEs that you have, the more increased risk of suicide attempts across the lifespan, increased risk for broken bones, heart disease, increased risk for heart disease, increased risk for lung disease, for liver disease, multiple types of cancer, also associated with impaired job functioning, under earning financially, houselessness, criminal justice involvement, struggles in romantic relationship. I mean, it literally impacts every
Every
every area. And we even, it's so interesting and shocking and interesting to me is just that like, how much it affects people's health.
mm-hmm.
And we think people walking around, oh, that's just, heart disease. Like, yeah, just change your diet. Yes, change your diet. And
And yeah,
and
do the
right.
work.
Yeah, all the other stuff, we got to get into this. So they have replicated this study many times across cultures with the same results. So it's a highly reliable study. Half of the leading causes of death are associated with adverse childhood experiences. And it's even more interesting when they have polled Kaiser Permanente medical professionals in San Diego, where they did this study, they didn't even know what the study was. All these medical professionals. So you've got medical professionals treating people for health-related issues that are being caused by unresolved trauma,
Wow.
not knowing that and not being trauma informed, right? So
Yes.
preventing adverse childhood experiences can reduce rates of depression by 44%. Toxic stress from ACEs changes brain development. We
Mhm.
know in trauma that trauma increases amygdala size,
Mhm.
the threat response center, and reduces hippocampal size, the memory centers in the brain. And we see this in PTSD patients and in patients, the most severe form, and this is a controversial statement, but the most severe form of PTSD is dissociative identity disorder. And my clinical experience with which used to be called multiple personality disorder, and my clinical experience with DID, dissociative identity disorder, is it's very much the most severe form of PTSD if someone truly has DID. And so we see we'll see differences in brain scans between a DID patient and a PTSD patient. Similar, but the DID patient has much more severe symptoms in the brain. So it literally harms your brain. Trauma literally harms the
Oh,
brain. Yeah.
and it affects every area
Yes. Yes.
of people's life. That's why I so many times repeat on my podcast that therapy, everybody should go to therapy.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
almost everybody, almost, not everybody. Let's
Yeah.
not generalize, okay? It's not healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. With a good therapist, there's a lot of variation out
Yeah.
there. And you want somebody that's continuing to train themselves, not just somebody who's done a weekend of trauma training.
Mhm,
It's really
mhm.
important to do your research,
Who is the
and
person?
understand. Yeah. And like, how much actual trauma training have they had? Everybody's calling themselves trauma sensitive and trauma informed. And in my practice and in my work, I tend to get the folks on the edges of the bell curve who are washing out of
Mhm,
traditional trauma treatment because it either harmed them or made them worse or didn't work for them, or it worked for a time and then they had to keep going. And so I tend to see, and maybe my sample is skewed in this way, but I tend to see what didn't work
mhm.
in trauma treatment. And then I've had to get really creative with how to help this person
Help.
in a
Yeah.
new way, So that takes a lot of a lot of nuance. Yeah.
Mhm. And can I ask you something personal? Of course,
Sure.
you have the right to
Mm.
decline my question. Do you also go to therapy?
Absolutely. 1,000%. I'm happy to talk about that. I don't believe that if you are a healer in this work, I'm using that broadly, whether it's like a coach or a therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, like if you are in a healing profession, you need to be in the work.
Yeah.
And people who are not in the work, it's dangerous. I'm concerned about because you are going to be projecting your unconscious. Can I swear on this podcast? I won't. Your unconscious stuff
Under.
onto your clients.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a lot of nuance there. And so, yeah, people need to be very, very aware and in really solid, consistent mentorship or supervision and therapy, in my
Mhm.
opinion. Yes. So yes.
I also go to therapy, and
Yeah.
I think it's important because I honestly don't believe in full healing. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
there is always something we can work on. That's
Yes.
my perception. There is always something. Yes,
Yes.
you get a good balance
Absolutely.
state, but it's not
Yes.
the end. If it's the end, we will not be alive, right?
Yeah. And what's the
Not
fun?
be alive.
Hmm.
There is always something we have to work on
Yes.
ourselves,
Yes.
although we're helping others as well. And
That's right.
Jenna, what is the difference between experiencing a trauma as a child and trauma during the adulthood?
Mhm. Everybody loves to say, or at least they used to say, kids are so resilient. Kids are not resilient. Kids are
Who,
adaptable.
who says that?
I
Who
don't know. People,
says
maybe it's a United States thing. I don't know where the saying came from.
Yeah,
People
kids are
love,
resilient because they don't have choices, right?
that's right.
If that's resilience,
Yes. Yes.
right? Okay.
Yes. Yes. So so there was a trying to remember the name of it. Chowla bus kidnapping.
Mm, I'm not aware.
What was that? The Chowchilla. The Chowchilla bus kidnapping was it something that happened that where there were 26 kids that were abducted back in let's see, when was it? In 1976
Mhm.
in Chowchilla, California. They were kidnapped and they were they say they were buried alive in the tractor trailer, and it was like they had buried like a room. It was like a room, and they were all put in there, and I think it was for a few days. And they rescued these children, and back in the 70s, at least in the States, they're like, oh, these kids will be fine. The kids were not fine. They had long-term psychological issues, health issues, because of the unresolved stress and trauma of this. The the difference between experiencing trauma as a child and as an adult, people's ability to cope with trauma as an adult is going to be directly connected to how safe they felt as a child in their environment. Were they cared for? If you went missing, did somebody come looking for you? Did things happen to you and then people did something about it? Or did they just let things happen to you? There's all these ways, and it was a parent, again, emotionally immature, using substances, emotionally unavailable, dissociated, have unresolved trauma themselves, have a mental health diagnosis. Like those are all things, if they're not resolved, a child is taking in. And I like to say we're like little potatoes in our parents' soup. We're going to take on whatever the flavors of that family system were. And so and also when we're born with trillions of undifferentiated neurons that have to be carved out and differentiated and essentially formed through social engagement and social interaction with your caregivers.
Mhm.
So if that goes well, that's great. And if that doesn't go well, children are going to walk around with issues, and they're going to be, again, less resilient as adults. And so somebody experiencing a big T trauma as an adult who had a fairly secure, safe childhood, you can resolve that big T trauma again fairly quickly. Somebody with a developmental trauma history, it's going to take a lot longer. And any big T trauma or shock trauma that you get into, it's always going to lead you back to their developmental trauma and their developmental issues. And a lot of the time, a major factor that I see in practice is, and what's oftentimes what the worst part of trauma for people was some version of someone wasn't there for me. It could be the most horrific thing. And they will say the worst part was that nobody came to help me.
Mhm.
My mom looked the other way. My mom allowed this or whatever, or my dad allowed this, or it just happened, or so I was alone. Nobody
Mhm.
heard me. That actually can be the worst part, is the lack of social connection and support from other beings in their environment. Yeah, there's a lot to be said about that, and to understand that, without resolving the developmental trauma that's at the core, you're not going to get very far in the adult trauma healing. Yeah.
Mhm. And here comes a question, especially for parents or those of the people that are
Yes.
planning to be parents.
Yes.
Like, what should parents know in order to provide safe and healthy environment for
Yeah.
children that are
Yes, love
growing?
this question. So I used to be a wilderness therapist. And I was a wilderness field staff. So we worked with at-risk youth and young adults out in the backcountry in the desert of Utah and Nevada. And we worked with the family systems a lot. So I saw a lot of family systems and did a lot of family systems work. And I worked with the kids and I worked with the parents. And I saw a lot of what went wrong in
Mhm.
these families. And I saw a lot of what the parents were doing, and then the reparative experience of the wilderness for the kids. And so I think in terms of parents, this is not about being perfect. It's really important to understand that. A good
Yeah.
Dan Siegel is a researcher out of UCLA, my beloved alma mater. I love I'm a big Bruins fan. But he's a UCLA researcher, a neuroscience researcher, and he talks a lot about the neurobiology of attachment, And he says a good enough parent is one that's attuned, half the time. They don't have to be perfectly attuned all the time, like constantly tuning into the child. It's actually not healthy for a child to be constantly tuned into. They have to know that somebody also has a life and their own self, and it's not all about them to some degree. But the other major factor is, does the parent have awareness of what their trauma is, even if it's not fully resolved, their childhood development and upbringing and the childhood trauma and any adult trauma? And do they know how that's showing up in their bodies and how that's then being projected onto their child? The parent needs to know that. If they're not conscious of that, it's going to, just like a therapist, it's going to come out unconsciously on the child. And so again, it's about being good enough and about doing your work. One of the best things a parent can do is to be in their own work with a really solid therapist and to take accountability for their own moods and their own issues. Because if they don't, the child will make it mean that they're bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the beginning of shame. And that's the beginning of a lot of other issues down the road. So if a parent can say, honey, I'm so sorry I yelled at you. I'm working on it. I'm not that we want to keep yelling at the child and that apologies make it okay if you don't change it, but I'm so sorry. I was really stressed and it's not your fault. It's not your fault. Even if the child was acting out, it's not the child's fault.
Mm-hmm.
The child needs to understand that the parent's feelings are not their responsibility.
Yeah, it's important.
You are not here to make me happy as my child. You are not here to meet my needs. You are not here to, because this is all ways parents objectify their child unconsciously, right? So you're not here to meet my needs. You're not here to manage my emotions. You're not here to fix anything in my life. That's my job. I'm the adult in the room, and I will both learn to regulate myself and help you regulate yourself. That's the formula for a healthy, secure upbringing.
Mm-hmm. I have heard during my psychological study that all the parents will mess it up with children
Yes.
because they
Yes.
are perfect people, right? But
Yes.
as long as parents provide safety and unconditional love to children, everything else is fixable later on. Everything else. Do
Totally.
you agree with that?
Yeah, yes. I would agree with that. I think that especially if a parent can own, here's what was happening for me. I'm so sorry. I was in a trauma response. I didn't realize, or I was married to your
Mm-hmm.
father and it was really tumultuous. And I'm so sorry about how that impacted you. Can we talk? And I'm open to talking about that. I'm open to repairing that with you.
But at what age children can understand that?
I think at a young age, I think it's just a matter of how you communicate that. There's a story of his name's Francis Weller, and he's a therapist, and he was talking about his young son, and something happened. They had some rupture between them. I think Francis was just upset about something, and it kind of came out, and he lashed out at his kid on accident. And the kid went away, went into another room. And then Francis he could have just left it. And he said, no, I'm going to go and check on my son. And I think his son was maybe 3 or 4. And he said something like, honey, I'm so sorry. How was that for you? What happened for you when I said that? And his son said, I thought you didn't want to be my daddy anymore.
Yeah, that's
It's just like, and then Francis said, oh, see, it's how the child makes it mean I'm bad. So daddy's going to go away. Daddy's stressed. Therefore, he doesn't want to be, because I'm bad. So therefore, he doesn't want to be my daddy anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And Francis said to him, no, honey, that's not, I love being your daddy.
Yeah.
You are so precious to me. And the kid was like, okay. And, and he went off and played and was okay. And so he understood it wasn't, my dad wants to be my dad wants to be my dad, and I'm okay. My dad just was in a bad mood, and that has nothing to do with me.
With me. Yeah. Communication
Yes,
is the
yes,
key, even with
yes,
children. Yeah.
yes.
We obviously cannot choose our parents, right? But we can
Uh-huh.
choose the environment around us as adults. So, how can we make sure that we pick up the right environment around us? So, what shall
Yes,
we look for in people around us when it comes to romantic
yes,
relationship and friendship?
yes, yes. Um, it's a
And
big
is it the
question.
same for all of us?
I would say so. I would say it's relatively the same in terms of like emotional green flags versus emotional red flags.
Mm-hmm.
You know, green flags in a relationship look like someone who validates my experience, who can listen to me, someone who, what?
Communication.
Yeah, communication, but then they can also, they have enough of a sense of self that they don't have to feel so threatened if I bring something into the relationship that is like, hey, this was painful for me.
Yeah.
And they can hear that, and they understand that, they still understand their own goodness, so they don't have to be defensive about defending their good intentions or defending their goodness. And so, in terms of our environment and those people, I think the more you get into your body, the more you start to understand what dysregulates you and what regulates you. So even like in your home, like, how does my home feel for me? Is it clean or is it messy? Do I feed myself enough? Do I feed myself nourishing food? Do I feel again, like you said, nourished by my relationships? It's all of those things, or pieces, are part of your environment, where you live. And those aren't all controllable all the time, but if you can continue to track, like, how does this feel in my life? Oh, there's like a mess over there and I haven't taken care of this place and it feels like bare and not warm and appealing. Like, I know that I need to start to shift that. Even like in your environment, like right now I've got a space heater on because this room tends to run a little cold. Keeping your body regulated or warm actually helps regulate the nervous system, because the parts of the brain that are connected to social engagement, social warmth, overlap with the parts of the brain that register physical warmth. So both of those are regulating for the nervous system and bring us into what we call ventral vagal social engagement, or like a kind of green nervous system state. Like you and I are having social engagement right now, and we're making eye contact, and there's resonance, and these things are really soothing. These are really healthy for us. And so the more you tune into where do I get dysregulated and where do I not? Like, if I'm always confused around someone, around what the truth is of things, that's a big red flag. If somebody's constantly gaslighting you or denying your experience, that's a big red flag. Right? How do I feel in this environment? And the more you sort of cut through, you got to really heal a lot of the developmental stuff, because people will think, oh, yeah, I like this person, but it's just because they feel familiar. Right? So you have to really work through the developmental trauma to start to get clear on what is actually working for you and what's not, what's just a trauma response.
Yeah, and to start really hearing your body, right?
Yes.
What does it say?
Yes.
And here comes the very deep question. I think it will be the last questions for part 1 of our
Okay.
interview.
Right.
So it's a deep one. I love that,
Yeah.
those questions. Do you think
Yeah.
that we're in unconscious collaborations with the people who cause trauma to us, and the vice versa?
Yeah.
And here, of course, I'm talking about trauma that is caused during adulthood, because as children, we don't have a lot of choices and options.
Yes. Yes.
Do we
Okay.
choose those?
As an adult.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. As an adult, yes.
And it's like,
Yes.
it's
Because
huge, right? It is
yes,
huge.
yes, it's a huge, because trauma begets trauma begets trauma. So the brain will look for things that are similar in the environment. So I will continue, if I don't heal my childhood with a narcissistic or emotionally immature, emotionally unavailable parent, I will continue to date those people as an attempt. Yes, because my brain continues to feel familiar with that kind of person, and they think that that's normal subconsciously.
Mm-hmm.
But also, yeah, and then we could get into maybe some spiritual stuff of like, and maybe this is being called for your own evolution. You're being asked to grow, and this person's going to serve as a mirror potentially. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not, very much interconnected and not responsible for the way we impact people. I don't want that to lead to that idea of, oh, that's just your feeling, and that I have no responsibility in that. You can just choose how to feel that way. No, no, no. We are very much connected to one another. We impact each other. You basically share a brain with your partner. If you have a romantic partner, there's parts of the brain that you all sync up about, and one person does certain things and the other person does the other things, and there's the brain frequencies that are connecting in that way and working together in a pattern. And there was a study that they did at MIT with business executives, and they told them, okay, you want me to create like a business plan, then you're going to come in and you're going to sell this business plan to your colleagues. And they put these sensors on them that was tracking movement and tracking heart rate and tracking all these different physiological signs of the person. So really somatic. They were tracking somatic markers essentially. And people voted. They thought they would go, they went and voted and they said, this is, and then they had to give their reasoning why they said this. And they said, here's why I gave. And they gave all these rational, logical examples for, I like this and this and this and this about the business plan. Okay. When they except when they analyzed the data, people actually voted for the folks who were somatically more confident, somatically more engaging, so like showing signs of belief in the product that they were selling. It was all physiological. It was all below the radar of their conscious awareness. So we think we're going into adulthood and making these conscious choices about our partners, but actually you're being driven by your body and your nervous system, pretty much full stop, until you work through those things in the body.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
We think we have choices, conscious choices, and most of our lives are just run by autopilot.
That's right. That's right. Yes, 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 yes.
Jenna, we're running out of time. I love the conversation with you. I have so many questions to ask you, but we'll leave them for the second part of our interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I so much appreciate your time.